This story takes place in the back country of the area I grew up in. Be warned, some of this may be too frightening for some. Reader discretion is advised. So back in 2019, I remember there being a big uproar of unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. This story is about probably one of the scariest things I've ever heard about, the Wendigo. A few months after my friend Jacob mentioned this big uproar, I went to go see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. I got back after being discharged, and one of the first things I did was go and see him. We're having a good old time, and he brought up the idea of going out to a little hangout spot that his now ex-girlfriend had taken him to when they wanted to get away for a few hours. So I decided why not. I grabbed my gun and we went out to this extremely secluded area and started messing around on the old dock that was there. It had pretty much been forgotten by the looks of it, poorly maintained, and some boards were almost completely rotted through. So about 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a little scary, even for me. Curious, I asked him about it. He said that if you went into the woods and said Wendigo 3 times, you'd come across the scariest looking thing you've ever seen. But me calling his bluff, I told him to prove it. To this day, I wish I hadn't. We start walking on this little path that led deep into the thick woods close to the Alabama state line. We walked for maybe 20 minutes and decided we were in a good spot. I feel it's worth noting that it had been raining a lot over the past couple days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. I turned to Jacob and he dares me to do it. I stood there in complete silence. The rest of the forest was almost silent as well, besides the tall pines swaying in the wind high above our heads. Reluctantly, I slowly started to say it. Wendigo. 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 Then, nothing happened. I let out a silent sigh of relief at the fact that nothing had happened. One thing about mine and Jacob's friendship is we loved it when one of us proved the other wrong about something. In our friendship of 10 years, I think it was one of the first times I had proven him wrong at anything. We started to talk a little bit of crap back and forth to each other when we suddenly heard a noise in the distance. Me still having the reflexes I had from the Marines, I immediately snapped toward the direction of the noise. I started to move closer to it, and then shortly after we saw a few coyotes running across the path, about 30 feet in front of us. I breathed another sigh of relief, but that relief didn't last long since I knew something was up. I didn't know what it was at first, but I just knew it was time for us to leave. As we turned to leave the woods, all of a sudden, a tall pine tree started to groan and creak, and began to come down. Noticing this, and in a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward as the tree came falling through the rest of the branches. It landed right between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree landed. I hopped the tree to get to him. I could feel his heart pounding like a drum as I grabbed him by his shirt and yanked him to his feet. He was still terrified and practically crying as I screamed at the top of my lungs for him to move now. I spun him around really hard, causing him to fall to his knees. Then I quickly got him up and we both started to sprint down the path back in the direction we came. I didn't dare look back, and neither did Jacob. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound came from behind me. Jacob! Jacob, come quick! It was the sound of Jacob's younger sister, Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me. The whole time he was screaming her name. I stopped him and said, "Jacob, look at me. It's not her. Do you hear me? It's not her." Just then another pine tree started to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob down to the ground as both of us were nearly crushed. I screamed at Jacob again. "Go! Get out of here! Go now!" As I was screaming that, I pulled my gun out of my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction from where we had come. Jacob made it to the opening of the trail and turned back and noticed I was still aiming my gun down the trail. "Bradley, get out of there! Come on! Hurry!" I turned and started sprinting towards him. As I made it into the clearing a good 50 feet, I turned, and me and Jacob both saw it. The thing we had ushered into showing itself. The Wendigo. It stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was practically no meat on its bones. It had really skinny legs, and even skinnier arms. Its skin a pale white, almost like a vampire's. But the thing I noticed most about it were the eyes. A vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Having had enough fear, I raised my gun and fired at it. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had killed it, turned and ran towards the car. I turned and did the same thing as he passed me. That was my first experience with the Wendigo, and I pray, almost every night, that I never have to encounter something that terrifying again. On September 13th of 2016, I was driving up the Bighorn Mountains above Buffalo, Wyoming. Just like every trip, I packed accordingly. 2 bottles of water, 6 Nutri-Grain bars, and my loaded handgun. I drove up 4 to 5 times a week, and as far as I knew, these mountains were harmless, besides predators seldomly seen and weather interference. But September 13th, instead of going to my usual neck of the woods, I went to a remote campsite known as Hettinger, 15 miles up from town. It's a beautiful place where if you cross the fence, you can climb to a peak and oversee for days. As I was looking over the majestic snow-covered landscape, I saw a tall, slender figure marching through the blanket of powder. Now, normally I would drop it as a hunter on the move, but Hettinger was far away from any known hunting locations. To this day, I wish I would have just packed up and left. I wish I hadn't peeked through my binoculars, but unfortunately, my curiosity got the best of me. I'll never forget the moment I peered through the cold glass over the winter plateau. As I focused my lenses and the figure came into clarity, I dropped behind the rocks. It was looking back at me, as if it could see me. That would be impossible for a human. I was 1,000 feet away or more, hidden by a rock and within the tree line. I peeked back up, using only the top of my head to look again. It was just standing there sniffing the air, looking at me. My heart sank and I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. About 200 feet behind me was a small rock cave, big enough to squeeze into and deep enough to hide in the dark. I slowly made my way, inching backwards. I took one last look and noticed it was sprinting towards me. I moved as fast as possible to the hole and tucked myself in. The moment I made it, the creature was standing feet from where I was. Its skin was damp in appearance and gray. It also had long hands and fingers to match what turned into dagger-like claws. I cut my mouth to hide my breathing, which became a challenge due to the cold. But as I moved my hand, a rock tumbled. I looked down at the rock just to look back up and see its cold eyes peering through the hole. It was almost as if it couldn't see me, but it knew something was there. I stood, still as a statue. It reached in, almost grasping my pack. After what seemed like forever, it gave up and took back to sniffing. I waited there in shock, unable to move or speak. It quickly got dark as night fell, and it finally wandered off. I waited until I felt safe to poke my head out. I took a look around and didn't see anything, not even a footprint. I took time in watching my steps to stay quiet and made my way back down to my car. I used my key to unlock it rather than using the button lock. I got in and sank down and took one last look around. Finally, I found the courage to crank my car and began to drive down the trail to the main highway. As I was just about turned around, I saw it again. It stood as tall as the trees and stared at me. I hit the gas and fishtailed, but I made it. As I reached the main road, it was in pursuit and was keeping up. But after a few miles, I looked back and it was gone. To this day, I haven't been back, not even to that region of the mountains. Looking it up, I found several myths about the creature and its origins. I'm not sharing this story to scare anyone away from the mountains, but please, stay safe and know the world is far more vast than we know. My friends and I go camping a lot, and my favorite place is in Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there often, and I've been ever since I was an infant. I'm 28 now and married with a kid, but I still go. It's the closest place to where I live where you can see the Milky Way pretty much every night. It's perfect for stargazing, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night I've been there. When we go without our son, we'll night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we'd go to trails we knew well that were used frequently during the day. Ones with log fences and gazebo resting places. The most used trail is one in Natural Bridge State Park that leads up to the Natural Bridge. This trail's around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done it every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It's very well lit until you reach the main trailhead, then it has no lights at all. It's used often, and while it's uphill, the difficulty's low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends have done it with me multiple times and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's the woods, and I was feeling like a little bit of a rebel anyway. When we used this main trail to hike to the top, we'd park in a lot designed for the pool in Hoedown Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool and you're at the first trail marker. You go up gravel for a while and pass the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's a waterfall and some lights, so it's best to go fast, and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road and there's a mini shelter to sit in, or a small rock wall to rest your legs. Then it's the beginning of the trail to the top. The night was weird to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, clouds took over and it appeared we'd be walking for nothing to stargaze at. But we went anyways just in case it cleared out by the time we got up there. In the beginning it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet, it seemed. You know you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant wall of limestone. During this time there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcome. My wife, my best friend at the time, and I all sat on the gazebo steps. The bench is under a roof, and it's darker than the rest of outside, so we just stayed on the steps. We were facing to where we were looking down the trail that follows the limestone wall. We each had a bright LED headlamp and a handheld flashlight. We don't usually look at each other when we night hike because the lights are so bright. We sit in a line like the Lord's Supper and walk in a line or staggered so we don't blind ourselves. It's after hours at this point. No ski lift rides had gone on for hours, and the rangers had already done their sweep and left right before we got out of the car and headed up. We left no time between them making sure the trail and top were clear and us starting our hike up. The ski lift takes you up to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave after it's clear. The reason I make this point is so you can understand just how shocked we were when out of nowhere a girl with a headlamp began to walk down the trail we were looking out at. She was in a sundress and flip-flops. This hike is uphill, and while it's a fairly easy hike, it's not easy with no water or real shoes. She'd have to have hiked up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reached where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo to down where we came from, she stopped. She just stood there straight on, like how a human is presented in an anatomical drawing. She was looking directly at us all sitting there, and her light made me bring my hand up to shield my eyes. She didn't turn away from our lights at all, or even seem bothered that she had 6 LED lights aimed directly at her face. I said hello, and she said hi back, but with a pause between every word. Something like, hello, how are you? I said something like, good, how are you? And she took even longer pauses and said, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there, completely still, with her hands to her side and facing and staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I had my hand up the entire time, until she just turned and walked slowly down the trail part that we had just come up. She got to a part where the trail turned, and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, until she turned and the light faded out of sight. We waited for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be me always being afraid, but no one ever came after her. She had done this hike alone, at night, and somehow without being found by any ranger. We got up after a bit and started back up to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had in the past, but we made it to the top. There are stone steps named Fat Man Squeeze that get you to the top of the bridge, and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we could hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from the left, then the right. We lay down and tried to stargaze, but the clouds were even thicker now. It was miserably hot. We could hear voices at times, and we kept checking to see where they came from, but we never saw anyone. Suddenly we saw a light flash, but never saw anyone attached to it. And then we heard a bird call, but it wasn't like a real bird noise at all. It sounded like a person making bird calls, like rhythmic and not natural. I was convinced we weren't alone and hadn't been alone. At this point, with everyone being just as creeped out as I was, we were all ready to leave. So we began going down the way we had come, and it felt like it was taking so long. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but it seemed like we weren't making any ground. It's hard to explain, but it was so weird that at one point I even said it out loud. I said, "This feels like it's taking much longer than usual," and everyone agreed with me. I kept looking behind me with my flashlight, as did everyone else. I just couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I could swear that I heard footsteps that weren't ours. I'd turn in the direction of any noise, but not see anything. My wife kept saying she was catching eyes in her flashlight. Usually you can catch raccoon eyes spying on you, or some animal like that. She was afraid maybe a bear or a big dog, but she never got her lights on whatever it was long enough to see the size or shape. Now we're hiking down a fairly flat area, compared to the downhill hike we had been doing before. The handrail is on our right side, and we're in a row walking within reaching distance of this barrier. And my wife just stops walking suddenly and says, "What's that?" But the question was more of an alert, so I moved my hand lamp in that direction and didn't see anything at first. But then both of her lights caught a shape, which we all shined our lights onto, and they reflected off of this light gray creature. It was bent in a crouching position, kneeling on its right leg, and it started running toward us, standing up slowly. It looked human, but it was too big. People often mistake bears for humans in the woods, but this was far too skinny. It was thin and tall, and almost white. It was so light gray. Its skin resembled dolphin skin. There was a shine to it, and our lights got reflected a little when they were on it. It gradually comes to a full standing position in front of us. Its head was long, and its eyes were nothing but empty holes. It looked, I guess you could say looked, directly at us in our lights. The way it stood was intimidating, almost like when a snake raises up, ready to strike. It was like it was stepping up to a fight. The arms hung down low, and the hands seemed extra long too, all the way down to its knees. I guess it stood 9 feet or so, and it wasn't very far in front of us. It had no hair at all, and its head was much larger than a human's. I couldn't process what I was seeing and was completely frozen. Then I just remember hearing someone scream, "Run," which snapped me out of it, and I took off, and it pivots and runs to the right. It was going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off running the rest of the way down the trail, knowing that this thing had just taken off much faster than us, and that after it had crossed from behind the barrier, it'd be gaining on us quick. We kept running as fast as we could, but some areas were so steep they slowed us down, and we felt like any second this thing could catch us. As we made it to the trail, beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the side crashing down through the forest. We ran until we got to the car, and then we drove as fast as we could. As soon as we got to the main road, the sky cleared up, and the stars came out. I knew that if we hadn't have seen that thing, it could have easily taken one of us and gotten away. I think the only reason it hesitated was because there were so many of us, and we stayed together. When we finally made it back to where we were staying, all of us took out our phones and wrote a note about what we saw happen. We hadn't spoken about it until after we looked at each other's phones and saw that the stories were all the same. Without a doubt, we had all seen something real.